For some reason, if it didn't, then that would be concerning. But okay, great, that's working. Doing good so far, so good. Um, yeah, Kendall, Weston, if you guys are like gonna share anything, do you guys have sharing access? If not, let me.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Oh, fun. Okay. I'll just be checking on like waiting rooms and stuff, but you guys are more than welcome to start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kendall Shepard. I'm a senior astrophysics and math major.
Hi, I'm Weston. I'm a junior astrophysics major.
Today, we're going to be presenting our research that has been white dwarf stars observed with NASA's Kepler and K2 space telescope.
So I'm going to start us off. First of all, what is a white dwarf? So generally speaking, a white dwarf is a late stage evolution of a middle to smaller size star, meaning that it's not so big that it'll explode and not so small that it'll just kind of fizzle out. So when this sort of star reaches the end of its life expectancy and no longer contains any fuel inside of it to perform nuclear fusion to support its large size, it will shed its outer layers and the core will collapse down into degenerate matter, meaning that it'll just become very, very dense and become very, very hot because of that extreme pressure. But because there's no fuel inside the star, it isn't actively undergoing nuclear fusion, and therefore it isn't creating heat and it is just cooling off. And therefore that makes it very, very dim, and it will cool down over periods of billions of years. So when categorizing these sorts of stars, astronomers have some important nomenclature to know. So this picture right here is what is called a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, or an HR diagram for short. So an HR diagram plots a star based upon its color, which correlates to its surface temperature, which is that bottom part of the graph there. And on the y-axis, it plots based on its magnitude or its luminosity, which is just how bright the star actually is. So the bottom scale of the graph is actually backwards. And so the hotter stars are on the left and the cooler stars are on the right as temperature decreases. And so as you can see, that section of white dwarfs exists at the bottom because they are very, very dim, and all the way over to the left because they are extremely hot. So as a white dwarf cools, it'll start at the top there and it'll move down to the right, cooling off.
So some basic information to know is that about 95% of all single star systems will eventually evolve into white dwarfs, and so that includes our sun. Their main classification is DA, meaning a white dwarf with a hydrogen-rich atmosphere, and DB, meaning a helium-rich atmosphere. They have a magnitude about 8.5 or greater, and in astronomy, it's backwards, so the larger the magnitude, the dimmer the star. So these stars are very, very dim. They have a mass limit of about 1.4 times the mass of the sun. That's also known as the Chandrasekhar limit. And they have a size about that of Earth. So you can see right on the schematic right here how tiny a little white dwarf is, and it has about 1.5 times the mass of the sun squeezed into that tiny little volume. So there's another classification called variable white dwarfs, and those we study. So this is another version of the HR diagram that Weston just showed you. This area right here, this green line, is the white dwarf cooling sequence. And as these white dwarfs cool down, they cross 3 distinct instability strips. So this is a helium-rich variable white dwarf, a hydrogen-rich variable white dwarf, and an extremely low mass variable, which we will not be talking about. But at these distinct temperatures, white dwarfs are observed to pulsate. And using astroseismology and finding these pulsating stars, we can determine things like internal structure, their composition, and important stages in their evolution. So we're very interested in finding these variable stars.
So in order to perform astroseismology and to study variable stars, you need what is called a light curve. So a light curve is really just a graph of luminosity over time. It's just the star's brightness over time. So we got our light curve data from the Kepler Space Telescope. The original Kepler mission was designed to just observe a single area of the sky in order to identify exoplanets, which means that this telescope is very, very sensitive to dim objects, which is very, very useful to us. However, near the end of the mission, Kepler had some equipment malfunctions that caused it to begin to rotate along this path, as you can see here. So astronomers continued to use the telescope and renamed it K2. And K2 continued to observe for another 5 years after Kepler completed its mission. K2 gathered short cadence observations, which means that it took pictures in very, very short time intervals. And because white dwarfs pulsate with a very short period, that's really useful in order for us to gather a light curve. So each one of those gray sections is one picture of that Kepler took. They are called campaigns, and those are where the telescope actually gathered data from those areas. And then on the next picture, you can see the original Kepler mission and the new K2 mission as it scans across the center of the galaxy. So our astrometry actually required 2 telescope input sources. First one, of course, was K2 that I just mentioned. And the second one is the European Space Agency's Gaia Sky Survey, which this is a picture of right here. So each Kepler campaign contains a few targets, but Gaia has surveyed over 1 billion stars and is on track to survey another billion very, very soon. So in Gaia surveys, they gather all sorts of important data that is useful for identifying these stars. First of all, it gathers their parallax, which is how much the star appears to move in the sky as Earth revolves around the sun. And they gather its apparent magnitude, which is how bright the star is on Earth. So it's not the actual brightness, it is just how bright it appears to be on Earth. And lastly, it gathers its BP minus RP, which is the change in color from the blue filter and the red filter. This is also called the color index. And combining all these sources allows us to process the data, which you can see on the next slide. So this is our data processing flow. So of course, the first thing you have to do is you have to go to the K2 campaigns, and from each campaign, you have to get the individual stars and you have to find their coordinates, so where they are located in the sky. And from there, you can give those coordinates to the Gaia database, and it will retrieve all the necessary information that we need of the things I mentioned earlier. And then once you have that information, you can then calculate the star's position on the HR diagram up there on the top right. So using the parallax, you can determine the distance to the star from Earth. And then using the distance of the star to Earth and the apparent magnitude, you can calculate the absolute magnitude, which is the actual brightness of the star. And that will place it on the y-axis of the HR diagram. And then from there, you can use the color index I mentioned earlier to find its relative position on the x-axis. So if a white dwarf falls within that area of the graph, then we know it's probably a white dwarf. In order to corroborate that, you can also look at the star's spectra on these pictures here. So there's another sky survey called the Sloan Digital Sky Survey that took spectra for many, many different stars. At the top there, you can see a picture that SDSS took of one of our white dwarfs. And a spectra is just a grouping of all the wavelengths of light emitted by the star, and it is indicative of the composition of the star. So white dwarfs have a very specific composition and therefore have a very specifically shaped spectra, as you can see there on the bottom left. So if a star falls in the correct area of the HR diagram and we can corroborate it with a proper looking spectra, then we know it's probably a white dwarf and we can continue to investigate it for variability.
So once we have all of our strong white dwarf candidates, we then go in with a processing system in Python. And usually we do this for each star, and after about 24 hours or 48 hours, we get a pretty graph like this. And this basically tells us a lot that we need to know about the star. So this is a star that we found in one of the campaigns. And you can see here it has a period of 0.14 hours. And so that's about 8 minutes, which means that this is a variable star. Variable white dwarfs, they pulsate with a range from about 1 minute to 25 minutes. So this falls within that range really well. We also do the Fourier transform of all of the white dwarfs, and this basically picks out the frequencies that the white dwarf pulsates at. So basically pulsations per unit time. And this periodogram, you can see it has a very sharp peak at the very small. So that means that this short pulsation period is very strong. It's not caused by noise, and that this is in fact a variable white dwarf. We also go in and we plot all of the Fourier transforms ourselves so that we can better determine if it's variable or not. So this star on the left is a non-variable that we found, and you can see there's not really anything going on. This peak at the beginning and these two peaks here are actually instrumental frequencies. They're from the telescope, and so we know to ignore those. However, this is the same variable star that I showed in the last slide. You can see that there's lots of activity going on, and this shows you all the different frequencies and harmonics that the white dwarf is pulsating at. So all in all, total, so far, we found over 150 white dwarfs that we've been able to confirm. We still have quite a bit more to go through and confirm, but these are the ones that we've been able to confirm. And we've also found 38 variable stars, which is really exciting. And those are the numbers that we expect to find within nature. We also found that average temperature is about 13,000 Kelvin to 10,000 Kelvin. In comparison, our sun is at about 6,000 Kelvin. We were also able to make color magnitude diagrams, which is just an HR diagram, in order to place better bounds on those instability strips that I mentioned a few slides ago. So here is all of the white dwarf stars that we've found so far. You can see basically this is the entire white dwarf cooling sequence, just kind of zoomed in from the HR diagram. And you can see it matches what we saw earlier, and this is good confirmation that these all are in fact white dwarfs. And we can also go in and plot only the non-variable white dwarfs. And if we do that, we get a graph that looks like this. And if you can see here, these are those instability strips where there's nothing at. So that helps us to place better bounds on the upper and lower limits of these instability strip temperatures. So thank you.
Well, is it my turn to ask questions?
What?
No, I'm asking more. So is it my time to ask questions? Or do we have an audience?
Any questions? Go ahead.
Okay, good. So could one of you just tell me more about how you correlated the data between the K2 and the Gaia data? I mean, both have, I guess, different spectrums or different bands where they kind of take the data in. Are they both observing the same spectrum?
Well, they observed a lot of the same targets, a lot of the same stars. All the data is pretty much open source. You can find it in databases. So the Gaia has observed many more stars than K2 has, and so Gaia has covered most of the ones that are in K2. So I basically just wrote a program that would take the coordinates for the K2 data and feed them to Gaia, and then Gaia would give me the results for the information that we needed back. And so because they're looking for different things, it doesn't matter that they're looking in different wavelengths or using different equipment.
Yeah. Also, each star has a distinct coordinates, RA and declination. So those coordinates are specific to that star, no matter what telescope is taking the data. So we can, those are, yeah.
Okay, and so the color index, the difference in the magnitude, is it, have you used the most accepted things? I mean, BP minus RP or J minus K, things like these. So have you sourced it from any paper where it was most frequently used, or is it one of the things you guys have decided, okay, these are the things that are DA or DB kind of white dwarfs?
So we decided we wanted to study DA, DB, and then those variable stars. The BP-RP is from Gaia, and it just tells us basically how red or how blue the star is. And from that, you can determine the temperature pretty accurately. Same thing with the apparent and absolute magnitude from Gaia. Those numbers, they come with an uncertainty value, and usually the uncertainty is pretty small so that we can be pretty confident in the distances, absolute magnitude, and all of that we calculate. But we do take that uncertainty into account.
Yeah, the BP minus RP is a value that Gaia calculated and we are using. It's not one we calculated ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And one last question: if you could go to the Fourier transform, does those frequencies correspond to anything? I mean, would that give any information?
Yeah, so these are basically the harmonics of it. So here is the basically the frequency that it is pulsating at is where these sharp peaks are.
Okay. Okay. Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great job, guys. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to ask, leave it in the chat. Yeah, and if not, we can move on to our second presenter, Sarah. But yeah, I just want to say great job, you guys. You did awesome. So,
Thank you.
and Sarah, if you're good to go, whenever you're good to go, should be the more appropriate statement. But
All right, can everyone see that? Okay, so I'm Sarah Rothrock and I'm a physics major here at Baylor University. And my presentation is going to be on exploring the effects of gravitational forces on complex plasmas. And our work is supported by NSF and NASA. So first, let's begin with defining what a complex plasma is. A complex or dusty plasma is an ionized gas that has dust particles suspended in it. These suspended dust particles become charged and behave as a plasma, which leads to many interesting phenomena. In my research group, we focus on understanding why these phenomena occur. In 2014, Plasma Crystal 4, or the PK4, was installed on the International Space Station, or ISS, which is a complex plasma lab that investigates complex plasmas in microgravity. The PK4 has produced complex plasma data for many experiments across diverse areas such as plasma waves, chains, vorticities, phase cloud behavior, and striations and ionization waves. With all the data that the ISS has produced, a method for verifying the effects of microgravity on complex plasmas was necessary, which can be accomplished by comparing their results to an experiment on Earth. This brings us to Baylor University's PK4BU, which is a ground analog to the International Space Station's PK4. The difference between PK4 and the PK4BU, other than one being on Earth and the other in orbit, is the accessibility of the PK4BU, because it allows us to have access to the electronic circuitry and the camera and diagnostic instrumentation. What my group focused on was understanding and measuring Yukawa interactions or forces between the dust particles and the plasma. For those who are unfamiliar with Yukawa interactions, think of the dust particles as people in an elevator. If you are alone in an elevator, you stand in the center, but what happens when another person gets on? You both choose opposite sides of the elevator, and if more people keep getting onto the elevator, everyone will try to evenly distance themselves as much as possible. This is exactly what the dust particles that are suspended in the plasma are doing. In a plasma, dust particles acquire a negative charge, and they repel each other until they can reach an equilibrium within the plasma. Other forces, such as electron and ion interactions, are present, but they are not the focus of our study. We want to measure the Yukawa interactions because we want to understand the exact mechanisms that allow the molecules in the plasma fluid to react to small changes in the environment. This is important because it can help us develop new applications such as advanced shock absorbers, artificial heart valves, or a method for folding proteins on Earth or in microgravity. My role in this project was developing ways to quantify our experimental data, and I'm going to show you all 2 different data movies collected from our experiments, and I want each of you to try and find the differences between the videos. Also, I would like you guys to think about how you would measure the velocity of each of these particles. So here's our first video from experiment 47. You can see that these particles here are moving like in the left direction. All right, now let's compare it to another video. So this is experiment 49. These videos look pretty similar to me. I hope that all of you guys can agree that finding the differences in calculating these velocities is pretty difficult. If you do disagree, I would happily invite you to sit down and try to measure the distances traveled by each particle by hand. Luckily, we do have computer programs that are able to measure the velocities and find the differences between each particle in the videos for us. The 2 programs that we use are particle tracking velocimetry, or PTV, and particle image velocimetry, which is abbreviated as PIV. Originally, we only used PTV, but due to some restrictions and modeling, we began using PIV instead, but we continue to use PTV to verify our results. The main difference between the techniques is that PTV uses a Lagrangian method, while PIV uses a Eulerian method. The Lagrangian method means that the program tracks each individual particle and how much it moves between each frame. The Eulerian method means that the program measures the mean displacement of groups of particles, which is the average distance the groups traveled between each frame. The Lagrangian method takes much longer than the Eulerian method because it traces every particle instead of just finding averages, but both techniques do have their own unique benefits to data analysis. In the methods of both techniques, data is first collected from either the PK4 or the PK4BU, and it's stored as an AVI file. In PTV, the program is run through Fiji or ImageJ, which is a common image editing software. So the first data file is opened within Fiji.
I'm afraid so. It was recorded earlier.
What was that? Oh, okay. Then you select the area you want to analyze and open the plugin Mosaic Particle Tracking to begin the analysis of each individual particle. The program then tracks each particle and calculates their individual velocity vectors. The data is then stored in data tables, and a small video of the particle's paths is produced, which is saved for further analysis later on. In PIV data analysis that is run through the program MATLAB, we first convert every frame into an image or BMP file that is stored within the experiments folder. Then we create a world core map, which is a single frame with 9 evenly spaced dots that are sized to 5 pixels that is placed over every frame in the movie. This world core map is used as a reference point for the PIV to track the groups of particles. Next, we create a mask that covers the areas of no interest in each frame. And then when the mask is applied, we run the PIV code, which calculates the mean displacement of groups of particles. After the PIV calculations are complete, we then create a quiver plot, a plot 3 figure, and a surf-C plot. These plots will be further explained in the results. A benefit of using PIV is that we are able to subtract in the X direction to remove unwanted forces, which leaves the remaining Yukawa interactions, which is the focus of our study. The figure on the left-hand side is created using PTV. This figure traces the path of each individual particle, and the PTV code also stores all the individual particle velocities into a data table, which can be used for later analysis. You may notice that the PTV figure is difficult to see the flow of each of the individual particles. So then we use the figure on the right-hand side, which is a quiver plot. This represents the mean displacement of groups of particles, which much more clearly visualizes the vorticity of the plasma. And this is a vortice right here. These figures represent a side view of the main PK4BU tube, which is here the circle in red. Due to the plasma and dust coupling that occurs, we are able to understand that these graphs accurately represent the plasma, which typically is very difficult to collect data on. The code for the last two graphical representations was initially developed by my group before I joined the research project. However, I was able to write a code that developed these two graphical representations of the data in 3D instead of 2D. These two figures allow us to better understand what the plasma is doing within the tube because of this 3D representation. These figures demonstrate the profile of velocities within a specific location in the main PK4BU tube. So the camera is like here on the side and then above on the tube, and we're able to use epipolar geometry to visualize this graph right here. Then the graph on the right is a SurfC plot in MATLAB, which is a 3D surface plot with a contour plot under it. The graph on the right is just, on the left is just a plot 3 in MATLAB, which plots the velocity vectors in 3D. In the plot 3 figure, each line represents each individual group of particles, and the SurfC figure demonstrates the overall displacements within the tube. Considering both methods of data analysis, PIV is the best method for particle tracking because it allows us to visualize the flow of plasma and particles in multiple ways. With PIV, we can now accurately demonstrate the flow of plasma through the PK4BU, and we can easily visualize the phenomena within the experiment. Another major benefit of PIV is it saves us a lot of time because the code can analyze large amounts of data at once, and instead of calculating the velocities by hand or modeling each individual graph, we have the code all in one place. This new way of modeling the flow of plasma is significant because it now allows us to have a deeper understanding of the interactions between dust and plasma within the PK4BU. In the future, we can hopefully better understand the exact mechanisms that form these dust plasma structures to unlock new applications with this new method of analysis. And this concludes my presentation. I would like to thank you all for listening, and my citations are available on the next slide, and I'm now available for any questions that you may have.
I have a question from the chat for you. And they asked, how'd you choose between PTV or PIV?
So PTV, it's like, it tracks every individual particle, and this takes a very, very long time for the program to run all the way through. So this made us like try to find a better way. And we ended up using PIV, which is originally used in microbiology for tracking particles in like the ocean. So then we actually took that similar code and we adjusted it to what we actually needed it. And it can take the averages of groups of particles instead of calculating every individual velocity vector, which still gives us an overview of what the plasma is doing. And we compared both of them to each other and they both verified one another. So
Very cool.
yes.
Oh, so how is motion of the ISS taken into account for the motion of the dust particles?
So what happens on Earth is typically, so it depends on the structure. This can get very complicated, so I'm going to try to keep it general. But what's happening on the International Space Station is that they're forming these long strings of dust particles instead of forming clusters or aggregates. So this means that gravity is causing these structures to form different ways, and we're still not 100% sure on why there's such a big difference, but it's still able to form different structures. So yeah.
Awesome. Very cool.
Generally.
Yeah. And if anyone has any more questions, you're welcome to send them in the chat.
Yeah.
So you have these two methods, PIV and PTV. So do you have any, full form for them? Do they stand for anything?
Yeah, they stand for the particle tracking velocimetry or particle image velocimetry. Yeah.
Okay, so since you're measuring velocity of these both things using two different methods, is there any way that we could take these both methods and then, take an RMS or whatever and get kind of average these both and then maybe get a better value out of these both? Or is it not sensible to do that?
I think you are able to. I'm not 100% sure if I'm being 100% honest, but I mean, the PIV is a very powerful code, and we are able to add it to like whatever we specifically needed. And our main problem that we focused on all last semester was finding a way to actually quantify our data. And because trying to understand what our results even meant was a huge uphill battle, it felt like. So we were trying to just figure out how can we put this in an effective graph that people can understand. So that was what our main focus was the past semester, and we're probably going to keep exploring that this semester too. So.
Okay, one more question. So you were talking about the velocity map or the graph of it. Mm-hmm. So if you're taking a movie, how difficult is it to get the 3D velocities, because you've plotted a 3D graph out of it? Because yes. I feel movie is more like a 2D thing. So how difficult was it to get 3D velocities out of it?
It was definitely kind of difficult trying to figure out how to get it all to work. And we ended up using epipolar geometry. So we had like 2 different cameras that are looking down like this. So like here's like the tube right here. Then we have like a camera on the side and then one on top. And we compare the results of both of the cameras to create a 3D graph of what's happening within the tube. And then after that, we like calculate the velocities of groups of particles for PIV. Sorry. And then after that, we're able to plug that in. It creates these matrices of all the data analysis, and we can use those matrices to create these graphs. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your question. Perfect. All right, any more questions?
Oh, great job to all of our presenters today. You guys did awesome. I learned so much, even as another astrophysics major. There's a lot that I learned from all of you. So yeah, great job. And if anyone does have questions, like I said, you're welcome to send it to us, or you guys are welcome to leave. We have our graduate school presentations starting in 25 minutes. So you guys are welcome to go to those if you would like. And if not, have a great rest of your day. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.